The weekly reading, if you start reading it from the beginning, it is filled with all sorts of instructions about how Moshe and the Israelite community are to build what is called in the Torah a Mikdash, a sanctuary for Hashem. And they're supposed to do that while they're traveling in wilderness. Now, a long time ago, I used to wonder, where did they get all the stuff that they built these things out of? And then I realized that they didn't leave Egypt empty-handed, actually. So there are extensive details in the Torah that talk about all kinds of matters and quantities of things and lists of materials and explanations of how these things are all supposed to fit together and be put together to create what is called a Mikdash, a sanctuary for Hashem. Now, it is very easy to read this parsha and just focus on all those details, and actually it's easy to get lost in all those details. In the end, as we go over all these instructions, and I've studied them a number of times, trying to visualize how it's all supposed to fit together, and the written instructions are just simply not enough. And then I read that Hashem actually showed Moshe how it's supposed to work, because sometimes written instructions are just not enough. So in Exodus chapter 25, in verse 8 and 9 is what I wanted to focus your attention on today. That's where my gaze fell, and I felt like the Lord was speaking to me on that. I wanted to direct your attention towards verse 8 for now. Hashem says, V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. And they shall make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in the midst of them. Very simple recap, an instruction, yet one more instruction. And it struck me that after all of these directions, after all of these instructions, God charged Israel to build him this Mikdash. He expects them to be able to do it, and he actually expects them to do it right. And Mikdash itself is a very interesting word. I don't know if you've considered or thought much about it, but we often just translate it as sanctuary. And when we say that in English, sanctuary, I don't know if it means anything to you or not. All kinds of ideas may flood your mind as you hear the word sanctuary. Different people have different connotations of that word. But where it comes from this root of Kuf Dalet Shin. When you see the combination of those letters in Hebrew, this is where all the words that describe holiness comes from. That's what Mikdash is. It's a place that is intricately connected to holiness. It is clearly a place. And it is clearly a place that is wholly set apart, set aside, distinct, different, designated. Designated for what? For God's presence, for his dwelling, for his glory. So Hashem's very essence, as we read in the prophets, in Yeshayahu, is described as Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We sing these words every single time we pray. We call it the Kiddushah, right? The sanctification of God's name. The angels in heaven sanctify God by proclaiming his holiness 3 times like that. So this is where the word Mikdash comes from. It comes from all these words in Hebrew that have to do with holiness really come from that. And Mikdash is just yet another word that derives from that same exact root. So it is something that's clearly meant to reflect God's glory. And I guess that is why all these instructions about the gold and silver and the precious jewels are in here. Because why would God want a dwelling place, a special domain built for him by using all these precious items? Well, obviously, it's to reflect his glory. Because if Moshe was shown really what the throne of God looks like, I'm sure it would be difficult for him to describe and replicate something like that on earth, but that's what they came up with. So it's remarkable that God actually promises to dwell in our midst if Israel is just make a special Mikdash, a special place for him. And it's also amazing to me that God puts a lot of trust in us, in Israel, to create this place for him. The instruction that he gives are quite specific, but it really is up to us, up to people, to make such a work happen. So in verse 9, there's another important detail, another caveat. Hashem adds, Ki kol asher ani mira'e otcha, according to what I cause you to see, et chavanit ha-mishkan, the pattern of Mishkan, or the dwelling place of God. So, as I read this, God says basically, I'm going to show you. Not I'm just going to give you all these instructions, but I'm actually going to show you a pattern. I'm going to visually show you what it's supposed to look like so that you can reproduce it out of all these instructions that I gave you. And so people often think that the words that we have in the Bible, the words that God has given us that came through Moshe, that's really all we need. That's all really we need to understand what God is and what He desires from us. But in this case, in this particular situation, it becomes very obvious that the verbal instructions are clearly not enough. Because even Moshe has to be shown, not just told what it's supposed to look like. God showed Moshe in Israel what to build and how to build. And throughout Jewish history, the words and the records that we have been given, the revelation that came in the verbal form has not really been enough. God has been showing throughout history to Moses, to Aaron, to Joshua, to the prophets. He has been consistently showing all the words that were written instruction and beyond those words. What do those things actually mean? And this is what a lot of times Jewish tradition calls Torah Sheba'al Peh, or the oral instruction, or the oral Torah. You may have heard that term. That always has been the case, and here we see that happening actually before us right there in the case of Moses. I don't want to go too deep into this topic and really go into the nitty-gritty of this passage and what happened and how, because again, that means we would get lost in all the details. At this moment, what I'd like for us to do is I'd like for us to read, to allow these words to sink into our hearts, to read them and to hear them in a personal way, and ask the right questions. You see, we do worship God with our intellect, but the heart is where it all begins. So what can these ancient words that I just drew your attention to teach us today? Well, you may have guessed my first point already. It's very simple. Hashem expects us to build Him a Mikdash. So that's what Hashem wants from us. He wants us to build Him this sanctuary, this holy place. He entrusted this to us. He gave us this task in the same way that He trusted Adam in Gan Eden to name all the animals. Do you realize that He just says, okay, you name them? He gave them responsibility, and it says that Adam named them the way they were. He looked at what their essence was, and He gave them the names that were appropriate to that essence. So the same is here. God is saying, I want you to build me a sanctuary, but I want you to do it. It's your responsibility to make it actually happen. And this heavenly abode that God has, it is His. That is His own place. But the Mikdash, the place, the sanctuary here on earth, is our part to make that happen. So I have to ask you an obvious question, a logical question. Have you made a Mikdash a place for Hashem in your life? Have you contributed to the building of a sanctuary in some way, shape, or form? Is it big? Is it beautiful? Is it holy? Is it set apart? What am I talking about? Well, you see, in the Torah, every Israelite took part in making this happen, the Mikdash happen, and they did this together. Now, we read how they voluntarily brought all these precious items and gifts, and some gave very ordinary items, not gold or silver or anything like that. They gave all these materials to make the Mishkan happen. God's tent came to be a place where God's glory dwelled and traveled with Israel. And in that sense, our job has not changed. Each one of us is supposed to build a Mikdash even today. So that brings me to my second point. Mikdash begins inside, but it doesn't stop there. You see, today people think that holy places and temples are a thing of the past. These are just relics of the primitive ways in which people worshiped God. And I am drawn to a passage where Yeshua explained to the Samaritan woman that worshiping God in spirit and in truth is what really matters most. You've read that place, you know what I'm talking about. This long dialogue out of which comes out this idea that really it's not about this mountain, it's not about that mountain, it's worshiping God in spirit and truth. That's what really counts. That's what matters most. And that's true. But don't forget that Yeshua Himself and His disciples all went to Jerusalem temple all the time. They went to pray, they went to worship. If you read John's Gospel, it constantly depicts Yeshua somewhere not far from the temple. Every time, every setting, every story in John's Gospel, he's either in the temple or somewhere round about the temple, just a stone's throws away. I like that. I think that tells me something about Yeshua. And so, if you know his life, you know that Yeshua worshipped at the temple as a young man. He was brought there by his parents. And then as he grew up, he continued to do the same. So, did he really think that temples and holy places were not important? No, they were. So we just read passages from Beit Parasha today where these things really mattered to him. And so even though we may have entered a new stage in life with Hashem, and many people believe we did, we believe that Hashem's Spirit dwells within us. Just as the prophet Jeremiah promised, that he will be in us. Guess what? We still need a holy sanctuary, even today. That does not change things. These chapters in the Torah that we read, they are still relevant. I know some people might want to marginalize them and say, we don't need any of this stuff because the Spirit lives with us. That's all we need. Each one of us is meant to create, really, a dwelling place for God in our lives. And that is first and foremost. Because guess what? That's where Mikdash begins. But that does not preclude us from building beautiful places of worship together. Places where we can assemble and we can praise his name. Rabbi Shaul, he admonishes those who follow Messiah to make sure that our personal Mikdash, our personal dwelling place, is pure and defiled by sin. That it is fitting for God's Spirit to come and live within us. And that challenge, ladies and gentlemen, continues to exist in our lives today. That challenge is still very much so. Yet that challenge actually is established in the words of the Torah, in the words of the Moshe that we read today. That's where it comes from. So let us build a worthy Mikdash together. Let it begin inside, but let it not stop there. That is what Hashem has charged us to do.